Hello, everyone. This is Andrew Hunt from the Bovine. It is my honor to moderate today's session. I think we have a very informative session for everyone today and a very timely issue. In today's day and age, we're always trying to figure out how we can manage our cattle better and how we can improve on our cattle's performance. And one of those issues is just how we can detect when their performance is going to deteriorate, i.e. knowing when they're going to be sick. So if you could know a day or two ahead of time that your cow is going to have a decrease in production and there's something you can do about it, there's certainly benefits to the operation that way. So with that, we do have Dr. Julio Giordano with us from Cornell University, who will be sharing with us some of their research that they have done in regards to AI-24 and the technology that way, and some of the performance improvements that they have realized with that. So we do now have Dr. Julio. We can hear you on the line, and we now have your screen as well.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate your introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. If I had muted my line already. Sorry. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Great. Excellent. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to be presenting this webinar today. And as Andrew mentioned, I'll be presenting today some of the research that my research laboratory here in the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University has been conducting in recent years in the area of automated health monitoring for dairy cattle. To start, I would like to provide you a brief outline of my presentation today. We will start with a very brief introduction of the importance of health monitoring in dairy farms and how automated health monitoring systems can be helpful to dairy farms to help them identify cows that may be suffering from health disorders. Once that we do that, we will discuss part of the research that my laboratory has been conducted in this area. And after we discuss the research, I would like to provide some examples and my perspectives about the potential implementation of automated health monitoring systems for health monitoring in dairy farms. To start with, a general introduction about the topic. I just would like to very briefly remind you of the importance of the early lactation period for lactating dairy cows. I think that most of you who are highly involved with dairy farms are very familiar with the multiple challenges that dairy cattle go through in the period immediately before and immediately after calving. Cows go through a series of metabolic changes and changes of their immune system that usually will result in immune suppression and negative energy balance. So the combination of this imbalances for cows are usually what will predispose lactating dairy cows to suffer from multiple health disorders in the early postpartum period. And of course, management is very critical here, and dairy farms will observe different levels of incidence of different disorders. But in general, most farms will observe a series of health conditions which are usually monitored by farm personnel with the intent of identifying these cows and trying to provide corrective actions. So among the health conditions that we usually observe in dairy farms, and you actually observe yourselves on a daily basis on dairy farms, we have conditions that are mostly related to uterine health, such as retained placenta, metritis, other issues such as mastitis, and then other metabolic and digestive system conditions such as dysplasia of meson, ketosis, hypocalcemia, diarrhea, and in general, in a small percentage of cows, we may also observe pneumonia. So we have this series of conditions, again, that tend to happen very early on in the early lactation period. And most dairy farms will make an effort to try to identify these cows so that treatment decisions can be made about these animals. Again, with the intent of trying to improve cow well-being, trying to improve the health status of the cow, but also because of the known impact of these health disorders in productivity, trying to avoid the detriment of health problems in early lactation, in subsequent milk production, as well as other parameters of performance, such as reproduction, health, or culling from the herd. So very simply, I think that everybody recognizes this very well. What I think that is important to recognize is the what farms do in terms of health monitoring and the type of strategies that farms are using. And I think that it's clear to everybody that there is quite a bit of variation across farms on what it's done. Our laboratory has recently conducted a survey study in about 60 farms in New York State, trying to better understand the type of health monitoring programs being used by farms. And not surprisingly, we found a lot of variation across farms for multiple aspects of their monitoring programs, such as the frequency of health monitoring checks, the type of evaluation performed by the farms. And because of that, because of the differences in frequency of checks and type of evaluations, we observe a very significant amount of variation in the amount of labor that is required to perform the type of health monitoring programs performed by these farms, as well as the type of health monitoring of aids used as part of these health monitoring programs. And what you see in this pie graph here is a very simple representation or a summary of the number of times that fresh cows were checked according to the results of our survey. And as you would expect, the vast majority of the farms, approximately 60% of them, check cows at least once a day. But on the other hand, we have the two other extremes where we have farms that will check cows twice or more times a day, and that represented a pretty significant proportion of the farms as well. About 36% of them monitor cows multiple times per day. And we also observe a rather small proportion of farms that either did not monitor cows at all, or at least did not have a systematic health monitoring program that was implemented on a regular basis, on a daily basis on farms. So basically, our conclusions are, just like I mentioned at the beginning, that there is quite a bit of variation. Most farms, as you would expect, are checking cows, some farms more than others. So basically, in summary, we can probably conclude that there is, in terms of health monitoring programs, this variation, it's observed, but in general, the programs, in particular for farms that implement these programs in a very intensive manner, they will be quite costly because of the labor demand and in some cases the aids used. They can also be very time consuming. Again, there are some farms that will monitor cows multiple times a day. And for the most part, these health monitoring programs will require qualified labor. So in general, most farms will use personnel that are very well trained to identify cows with health disorders, and in general, that type of personnel usually requires quite a bit of years of experience or a lot of training in the area of health monitoring. So there are many, if you will, many drawbacks to health monitoring programs, which are they're absolutely necessary. So the question or the point I would like to make is that there is within health monitoring programs that are used on farm, there is potentially value to some of the automated health monitoring technologies that became available in recent years. As you may be very well aware of, there are more and more of these technologies and usually sensor systems that become available. Basically, with this cow in here, I'm trying to represent the variety of sensors and different monitoring systems that are available, all the way from sensors that are attached to collars, leg bands, intraruminal sensors, sensors that monitor parameters in the milk, scales, automated imaging system, as well as systems that monitor environmental conditions. So basically, the idea is that some or all of these automated health monitoring technologies may provide some advantages to dairy farms. So among the potential advantages that these systems could provide to dairy farms is probably one of the most important ones, the potential to reduce the burden associated with health monitoring programs. As we just reviewed, so these monitoring programs can be time-consuming, they require qualified labor, and they can also be costly. So the question is if through the use of these automated health monitoring systems, we could have a first line of attack or a first line of defense, to try to identify cows with health disorders, basically a system to screen cows initially and try to identify those animals that need attention. On the other hand, the fact that these technologies or these automated systems tend to collect always the same data and process this data in the same manner, there is potentially value on more consistency and objectivity of the data. So one of the challenges with health monitoring programs performed by personnel is usually the subjectivity of the method and the diagnosis of health disorders. A cow that is suffering a health disorder may be diagnosed differently by two different people. So there is a potential opportunity here with these technologies monitoring in an objective manner the same parameters over time in individual cows to try to improve the accuracy and reliability of the diagnosis of health disorders. And last but not least, I think that there is a potential to reduce the disruption of cows, basically reduce the disruption of cow normal behavior. So the fact that we can have a sensor system monitoring our cows that ideally will tell us or farmers of which one are the cows that need attention presents a unique opportunity to not have to evaluate the health status of a lot of cows that are not affected by health disorders and allow those cows that are healthy to continue doing or expressing their normal behavior. These cows may want to be resting or eating or doing things of their interest instead of having to be either locked up in headlots for daily health monitoring or be sorted through sorting gates and put in special pens for a period of time. So there are multiple other potential benefits or advantages of these monitoring systems that we can discuss at the end. Certainly, there are a lot of ideas on how to incorporate these technologies, but I think that at least these three ones represent a lot of the potential advantage that farms can get from this type of technology. So because these technologies, or at least some of these technologies, are relatively new, there is relatively limited data about the ability of these technologies to identify cows with health disorders. So here we have a pen of fresh cows at a dairy farm, and the basic idea of using these automated health monitoring systems is that we would be able to pinpoint the cows that need attention, whereas the cows that do not need attention because they are healthy are left alone. So basically, up to the point that we started doing some research, as well as many other groups in the U.S. as well as around the world in this area, there was limited information about the ability of these systems to truly identify cows that need attention, which is what led us to start working in this area of research. So I'll go on now to describe one of the experiments that our lab has conducted in this area. So basically what we have done was to evaluate the performance of one of the commercially available rumination and activity monitoring system. This was at the time that we started working in this area in 2013 or 2014. So basically, the system that we used back then for our research was the HR tag from SCR Dairy. This tag is mounted in a collar. Okay, so and this tag will monitor the two parameters of interest here, which are rumination activity and physical activity. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details about the system. I'm prioritizing the application of the system and the observations from our research study. But in very simple terms, this automated rumination and activity systems, they are placed on the neck of a cow and will monitor individual cows. And what you can see on the screen are two screenshots from the software that is part of the system. On the left here, you have the pattern of rumination. In purple, basically is the representation of daily rumination for cows with a pretty significant reduction in rumination time around calving. So that is part of the normal physiological changes that cows go through calving, and then a very significant increment to pre-calving levels for rumination activity in dairy cows. On the other hand, the system also monitors activity, and in this case in particular, this graph is for a cow that showed two estrus events. The purpose here is to use it for health monitoring, but just to show you how the changes in the level of activity can be detected with this type of system. So in the gray area, you see the daily activity monitored by the system. So basically for this research, we had two very simple questions. Our first question was, what would be the performance of this automated health monitoring system, or the HR tag system from SCR Dairy, to identify cows with health disorders? And another very important question that we had was when. So as you would expect, this automated health monitoring technologies would be the most useful to dairy farms if, first of all, the cows can be identified, so cows are suffering or about to express clinical signs of a health disorder, but also the timing, right? So ideally, cows will be identified, or an alert will be generated for cows very close to the timing at which cows express clinical signs, or immediately after, to allow dairy farm personnel to implement a treatment or any corrective action. So again, two very simple questions: how well the system would perform in a commercial farm setting to identify cows with health disorders, and the other question was when the alert generated from the automated health monitoring system will occur in comparison to clinical diagnosis by farm personnel. I'll go on to describe in more detail our experimental design in a few minutes. But before I go on to describe the experimental design, I wanted to very briefly introduce a very important component of the system that was used for our research. So what you see in this slide is a screenshot of what is usually called the Health Index Report, which is part, again, of the dairy software from the HR tag system. And basically, this report can be set up it can be customized by dairy farm in collaboration with the company to include cows that should be screened or evaluated because they potentially have a health disorder based on rumination and activity. And I really don't want to distract you with all the numbers that are included in this report. There are many numbers, and again, this is customized based on the particular interests of the farm. But what is important to understand, and this is very relevant for our research, is that this health index score, so health index score is basically a number generated through an internal algorithm developed by the company that created the system, by SCR Dairy, that indicates in very basic terms the probability that a cow is sick. The lower the value for the health index score, as it can be seen here, the higher the likelihood that the cow may be suffering from a health disorder. In general, the cutoff used for health index score is of 86 points. So a report like this one can be set up at a dairy farm to include cows that have a health index score of less than 86 points. In theory, those would be the cows that the dairy should put the attention on, because these would be the cows that are suffering from a health disorder. And again, the lower the number for the health index score, the higher the likelihood that the cow may be suffering from a health disorder, and that explains the difference in colors for cows in the list. Why this is important for our research? This is important because we use health index score from the system as the alert to consider a cow as potentially having a health disorder. So basically, we use the predetermined value of less than 86 points to determine that a cow was flagged by the system and consider that a positive outcome for our research. Basically, any time that a cow had a health index score of less than 86 points, that cow in theory was flagged for further clinical evaluation and consider a positive outcome. So to give you a little more detail about the design of our experiment, it's rather simple. So we work with a commercial dairy farm within about an hour of Cornell University. For this research, we enroll about 1,120 cows from November of 2013 to 2014. And the experimental design was very simple. We basically put collars on cows approximately a month before calving, because this system, as well as most systems that will have internal algorithms to calculate an index of cow health, need a period of baseline data collection, because cows are usually not compared with other cows, but rather to the previous data from themselves. So cows are benchmarked against themselves. Some systems will incorporate some data from group cows. So because of that, the system needs a few days, anywhere from 4 to 7 days, to have sufficient baseline data. So our intent was to start having the health index score within the 3 weeks prior to calving, all the way up to approximately 80 days post-calving. So during this period of time, cows were monitored by farm personnel following strict standard operating procedures. I will not go on to describe the type of health monitoring programs, but I can summarize it by saying that the program was very intensive, that the protocols that were in place were designed to make sure that very few cows would not be detected if they were actually expressing a health disorder. So it was very intensive monitoring in particular within the first 10 days in milk. If you have questions about the health monitoring program, I will be very happy to discuss them later. So we monitor cows to make sure that all the common health disorders in the early postpartum period were identified. And at the same time, data was collected from the rumination and activity tags, and we collected also data for the health index score. So basically, we collected during this period from 3 weeks pre-calving all the way to 80 days pre-calving all the data generated by the automated health monitoring system. And a very important aspect of our research is that farm personnel were blind to the information from the system. So basically, our gold standard for comparison was the clinical diagnosis by farm personnel. That is very important to recognize. The data generated by the automated health monitoring system was not used to diagnose cows or to identify cows with health disorder during the study. The premise of the study, or the objective, was to retrospectively compare the performance of the system. So we basically have, for every day, for every cow, whether an alert was generated for that cow based on a daily report of health index score, and then retrospectively contrasted that data to clinical diagnosis. So if anybody is very interested in learning more about a lot of the details on how the experiment was performed, as well as some of the results and conclusions that will not be able to present today, the results of this experiment have been presented in 3 different manuscripts in the Journal of Dairy Science, which you can access through the journal. So in terms of the results, so our observations for the experiment, we divided the data in metabolic and digestive disorders, mastitis, and metritis, because of some of the differences that we observed, as well as some of the differences in the incidence, as well as the management associated with these health disorders. So I'll start by presenting the data for metabolic and digestive disorders. So I'll show you now the data for displaced abomasum, ketosis, and indigestion. The 2 critical pieces of data for us were, first of all, in response to the answer to our first question, how well does the system perform to identify cows that may be suffering from a health disorder? That is evaluated through the sensitivity. So basically, the percentage of cows that were diagnosed with a clinical health disorder for which the system generated an alert through health index score. So basically, the ability of the system to flag cows that were identified by farm personnel as having a clinical health disorder. The other outcome of interest, which was related to our second question, was the timing. So when the first system alerts come in relationship to the time of clinical diagnosis. So the number of days from the time of clinical diagnosis to the first alert generated by the system. Any time that the system generated an alert before clinical diagnosis, you will observe a negative number because the alert was generated a few days or a few hours before the diagnosis by farm personnel. So anytime that you see a negative number, that means that the system alerted us before farm personnel identified the cow. So as you can see, for displaced abomasum, so the sensitivity of the system was pretty high. 98% of the cows were identified by the system, and on average, cows were identified 3 days before clinical diagnosis. For ketosis, 91% of the cows were identified by the system, and on average, that happened within 1.5 days before clinical diagnosis. For indigestion, 89% of the cows were identified by the system. I would like for you to pay attention to the number of cows. We did not have as many cows with indigestion as for the other disorders. So we think that part of the results for lower sensitivity might be explained by the low number of cows. And on average, cows were identified half a day before clinical diagnosis, a difference that was not statistically significant. So because of some of the similarities in pattern and type of disorder for metabolic and digestive diseases, we combine them all and also to have all more statistical power. So overall, the system generated an alert for 93% of all cows that were diagnosed by farm personnel. And on average, the first alert was generated 2.1 days before that of farm personnel. So basically, it seems like the system was at least quite effective to identify cows with metabolic and digestive disorders. However, because not all cows were identified by the system, we hypothesized that there may be some differences among cows in terms of the severity of the disorder that may have affected the ability of the system to identify cows or at least generate an alert for these cows. Because of that is that we evaluated our data a little bit further, and what I'll present you now is basically the change in the parameters of interest, rumination, activity, health index score, and I'll also add daily milk production from 5 days before clinical diagnosis to the day or the day of clinical diagnosis or the nadir for the parameters of interest. So we were basically trying to determine what was the absolute or percentage change in the parameter of interest from 5 days before to the day of the nadir or the day of clinical diagnosis. Because again, our hypothesis was that there may be some cows that were not having as severe of a problem as other cows, okay? So basically, I will not spend a whole lot of time. I can show you this later if we have time, but we observed some very different patterns in health index score, rumination, and activity for cows that were healthy, represented here in the green line, cows that were identified by the system, which we refer to as health index score positive, and cows that were not identified by the system. So the whole idea was to try to see how these cows that were not identified by the system behave and whether they behave more as healthy cows than as cows that had a health disorder. So the results presented in this table represent the percent change from the 5 days preceding clinical diagnosis to the nadir for the disorder for cows that were healthy, in green for cows that were identified by the system, and then for the few cows that the system did not generate an alert for within the 7-day window of interest. And I will not spend a whole lot of time describing this data. This is rumination time, this is daily activity, health index score. But basically what this data told us is that cows that were identified by the system have way more dramatic changes in the parameters of interest than healthy cows, as you would expect, but also in comparison to cows that were not identified by the system. So, this data seems to suggest that these cows that the system did not generate an alert for behave more closely to healthy cows than cows with a severe, that were identified by the system. And one of the very interesting observations were the differences in milk production. So basically, cows that were healthy and cows that were not identified by the system were not statistically different in terms of milk production within 5 days of clinical diagnosis or the nadir for the parameter of interest, whereas cows that were identified by the system have almost a 30% reduction in milk production. So if milk production level is used as a marker of overall cow health or well-being, And also, if you think from the implications, the importance of milk production, for dairy farms, it seems like the system was able to identify most of the cows that probably need to be identified from health and production perspective. So to move on here, I just wanted to show you very, very briefly an example of a cow. So this is an individual cow. This is the individual cow graph for rumination time for a cow that developed ADA. And this is quite interesting. This is what a lot of dairy farms will look at. So here we have the pre-fresh rumination time, the very significant drop in rumination observed around calving. The cow went back up again, and then around the timing of the DA was diagnosed, which is exactly at the time that the arrow points in the graph, this cow had a very dramatic in rumination time. So just to give you at least one example of the very dramatic changes that are observed for some cows. So we'll change gears now and go to the results for metritis, and then we'll go through mastitis. So in the case of metritis, the results were quite different than for metabolic and digestive disorders. The sensitivity of the system was 55% overall for all cases of metritis. For those cows that were identified earlier than farm personnel, for those cows that were actually identified by the system, they were identified or an alarm was generated earlier by the system than through farm personnel. But because of the relatively low, or at least lower than for metabolic and digestive disorder sensitivity to detect cows with metritis, is that we looked a little bit further into our data, because for metritis more than for metabolic and digestive disorders, we hypothesized that there would be cows with different levels of compromise due to the disorder. So one way that we were able to separate cows based on severity was based on treatment. So as part of the standard operating procedures at this farm, cows that were deemed to have a more severe case of metritis were treated with one particular antibiotic, whereas cows that had a milder case of metritis were treated with a different antibiotic. So the cows that were treated with a cephalosporin antibiotic were those ones that the farm considered to have a milder case of metritis. And as you can see here, and as expected, the sensitivity of the system to identify these cows was 49%, whereas for the other group of cows, those ones that the farm considered to have a more severe case of metritis, and because of that were treated mostly with ampicillin, then in that case, the sensitivity of the system was much higher. So if you agree with the concept that there is a difference in severity for cows treated with the different antibiotics, and this is what the farm was trying to do. So basically, what this data is telling us that cows that have a more severe case of metritis would be identified by the system, whereas cows with milder cases of metritis would not be flagged by the system. Just to give you a brief snapshot of how it looks like in terms of health index for cows that were or were not identified by the system, and how they compare to healthy cows. So again, here you have in green healthy cows at the same days in milk. In red, you have the cows that were diagnosed with metritis, and the system generated an alert for these cows within the window of interest. And in blue, you have the cows that were not identified by the system. So from a health index score perspective, the cows that were not identified by the system, they basically behave as healthy cows. So the question is, so were these cows truly affected by metritis or not? So would it be really detrimental to miss these cows if a farm is using a system like this one to identify cows with metritis? So as you would expect, we went on to look at milk. So we look at milk production within the last 5 days before clinical diagnosis. for the 3 different groups of cows, and we separated primiparous cows and multiparous cows because of the known differences between these groups of animals. And, as we expected or we hypothesized, the cows that were identified by the system had lower milk production as compared to healthy cows and cows that were not identified by the system. So this is once again supporting the idea or the hypothesis that the cows that the system is identifying are those ones that have a more severe case of metritis. And the observations for primiparous cows were very similar to those observed for multiparous cows. So very dramatic differences for cows that were identified versus not. So for mastitis, we observed results that were very similar than those for metritis. The overall sensitivity of the system was about 50%, 53%. Again, the cows that were flagged by the system were flagged earlier than diagnosis by farm personnel. So, as you know, this data here includes cows with subclinical mastitis. So we went further and we isolated cows that had clinical mastitis only. So as you would expect, there's a little bit higher sensitivity and a little bit earlier diagnosis. But more important than that, we evaluated the data and the sensitivity of the system for cows that were affected by different types of mastitis. So thinking that different type of pathogens, cause different type of clinical cases of mastitis, and the system may perform differently. Sure enough, those cows that had mastitis caused by E. coli, which, as you know very well, those tend to be the toxic cases of mastitis, the sensitivity of the system was in the 80% range, whereas for gram-positive bacteria, Staph aureus, and cows with no growth, so those ones that in general don't tend to affect the cow as much, the sensitivity of the system was not as high. So once again, this data for mastitis seems to support the notion that those cows that are severely affected by the health disorder, that may be systemically affected by the health disorder, will be much easier or better identified by the system. Last but not least, for the results of our experiment, I just want to very briefly show you the data for false positive outcomes. As important as it is for this automated health monitoring systems to be able to identify cows that may be suffering from a health disorder, it is also very important that the system does not generate a very high number of false positive outcomes, because it would defeat the purpose of using such a system. If a system generates a lot of false positive outcomes, the farm would end up checking pretty much every cow, and there will be no potential benefit of using the system. The data for this experiment, which I have to remind you that was a retrospective and not a prospective evaluation, was quite encouraging, with a very low rate of false positive outcomes. As you can see here in the denominator of our calculation. So we basically look at the performance of the system every day for each one of the 1,100 cows that were enrolled in the experiment, and because of that, we have such a high number of basically cow days at rest. So the sensitivity the specificity of the system was pretty high and generated a very low rate of false positive outcomes. So moving into another important part and the final parts of the study here. So another important consideration is that not all tags function perfectly during the study. So we had approximately 3.7% of the tags that malfunction or were misplaced. So this is an important consideration, at least for this system, which has to be placed at a very particular location. So in the next, so this picture shows basically the ideal location where this type of tag should be placed. And when the tag is not in the right place, or when the tag is malfunctioning, a report like this one will show up for individual cows. So basically, there are levels of rumination or levels of activity that are usually incompatible with life, and because of that, the system will generate a report with cows that need to be identified, and the tag should be either placed in the right position or it should be checked for functionality. So this is important to recognize. And again, in our study, we have a little below 4% of the tags that malfunction. So to conclude, the results of our study seem to indicate that at least this heat and rumination system, which monitors, again, rumination and activity, is effective or the most effective to identify cows with metabolic and digestive disorders. So we observe a relatively lower sensitivity to identify cows with metritis and mastitis, but that lower sensitivity is explained in particular or the most by a less severe systemic illness or the type of mastitis causing pathogen. Basically, it depends basically on how severe the disorder is that the cow will be affected. And finally, the HR system identified cows, or the first alert for the system was generated earlier for cows with DA, ketosis, metritis, and mastitis, at least in comparison to farm personnel for this particular farm and following the specific standard operating procedure followed by this farm. These results, as you would expect, can be different for different farms, but at least these are the observations for our experiment. So I'll move on now to the area where I'll give you a little bit of my perspective and some of my observations on how these technologies can be used on farms. So one of the things that is interesting about this type of technology is, again, the opportunity to identify cows early in the disease, and that can, as you would expect, be seen as an opportunity for dairy farms, in particular the opportunity for earlier treatment, which you would expect that would result in an improved response to the treatment, improved well-being, and there's also the potential of preventing some associated disorders. Just to give an example, it is very well known that cows with ketosis, with clinical ketosis, can go on to develop displacement of Malfunction. So if a cow with ketosis can be identified promptly to treat that condition and prevent cows with DA, that could be beneficial to dairy farms. However, these may also represent challenges. So the potential to identify cows earlier may be, in some cases, frustrating because the automated health monitoring system may be indicating that a cow is suffering from a health disorder. However, the cow is not yet expressing any clinical signs of disease. So if farm personnel uses the automated system to identify cows, and when they go on to confirm if the cow is suffering from a disorder and the cow is not expressing any clinical signs, it may be problematic because it would not be possible to determine what corrective actions to take. So I think there's a lot of research to do in this area, but some of the potential ideas would be to make treatment decisions in the absence of clinical signs, but based on what the farm usually observe for these cows. So if a farm tends to observe a lot of cows very early on, and then there are records of what is the actual clinical disorder that the cow expresses a few days later, that could be used to make some treatment decisions. However, I personally think that requires a lot more research. So it's an area that needs a lot more attention. And the other alternative is the use of prophylactic treatment. So again, with the idea of trying to prevent associated disorders or improving overall cow health, some farms may implement prophylactic treatment to try to avoid problems down the line. But again, I'll emphasize the idea that there's still a lot of research to do in this area. So the other thing that I find interesting, I think that regardless of how farms can use this type of technology, I think that there are opportunities for different type of farms. If you recall early on, I show you some data that there are farms that check cows once a day, but we also have some farms that have very intensive health monitoring programs. Even within the group of farms that check cows once a day, some farms will spend a lot of time, a lot of effort trying to identify cows, whereas there is a subgroup, usually a smaller subgroup of farms that will do very little to identify cows with health disorders. I personally think that there are opportunities for both. For those that have very little to no intervention, there is the opportunity to identify cows with health disorders that are not being identified at the moment, and because of that, being able to treat them and improve their overall health and productivity. On the other hand, for those farms that have very intensive health monitoring programs in place, there is an opportunity to reduce labor and reduce cow manipulation. So basically, let the system do the initial screening, identify the cows that will need the most attention, and only focus the attention on those cows. So again, I think that within the spectrum of farms for health monitoring programs or the type of health monitoring programs, these automated health monitoring technologies may have a place in a lot of farms with very contrasting management programs. So, and just to finalize here, so just a few ideas for actual on-farm use of the technology. So a potential way to use a system like this one used in our experiment that generated the health index score, or any equivalent type of parameter that helps identify cows, would be to include the score in the fresh cow list, or even generate the cow list, the fresh cow list, based on that score or that parameter. So basically, just include in the list of fresh cows to check those ones that have a score that is below the cutoff determined by the company in collaboration with the farm, and reduce the number of cows that are checked every time in their fresh pen. So I think that this is one of the greatest areas of opportunity. So run or generate the list of fresh cows based on the data generated by the system. And of course, this can be customized to include farm-specific parameters of interest or cows that need to be rechecked or so on. So a lot of opportunity here, and this is just a general idea. I think there's a lot to do at the farm level. And another, I think, important aspect to consider is the fact that for some of the health disorders, this automated health monitoring system may not be able to identify all cows. So farms will need to continue using some of the traditional health monitoring protocols or strategies. So a good example is Metritis. If you recall the results from our experiment, not all cows with Metritis were flagged by the system. So there is a possibility that the farm that uses a system based on activity and rumination may miss some of the cows that have Metritis. So a potential way to offset the detriment of missing cows is to first or design a hybrid program in which the data from the automated health monitoring system is used in combination with traditional monitoring. In that case, I think that it may be a good idea to first identify the specific pattern of Metritis or the disease of interest diagnosis at the particular farm, and then identify specific days in milk at which it would be reasonable to include an additional examination with any of the traditional methods, and basically use the system to identify cows that are going through a more severe case of the disorder. I think that based on our data, the type of system that we use in our experiment will identify most of the cows with severe disorders and use traditional examination to find the cows that the system would miss. So basically using the system in combination with a minimally disruptive method such as visual observation all the time or every day in the period of time when cows are more likely to have a health disorder, and have a specific checkpoint at a specific days in milk, include an examination that will help the farm identify those cows that have not been flagged by the automated health monitoring system. So again, this is just one example. It's one example for one health disorder. I think that this can be, customized to the needs and the particular conditions of every farm. With that, I conclude my presentation, and I would like to thank you for your attention today, and I will be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to reclaim screen here for a second. Okay, there we go. And we've had quite a few questions come in, but first of all, thank you, Julio. A lot of information in there that I think gets the mind just churning on how better to manage our herds. And with that, there's been quite a few questions come in. A couple of the ones I'll just go over quickly. Chris, you sent in a question about, was there incidences where the HI index identified cows that might not possibly have a disorder, i.e., I think Julio covered that in slide 23, which was the false positives. So I'll just show that to you again here. There you go. Oops, if I jump to slide 23 though. And we'll jump to slide 23. You'll see that there was the 2.4% in there, so very small number. So not like you'd spend a lot of time chasing cows that had no issue at all. And then kind of a similar question that Mark, that you had sent through for the 7% that the system did not identify. Were there reasons for this? And I believe in slide 19, Dr. Giordano covered that and just showed that there was no performance difference, so you wouldn't have seen a measurable difference in performance. And then I think you also covered that if there's no difference in performance, is it an issue that you would have needed to identify? But then we do have a bunch of other questions here. So here we go. The first one, and I think you covered a bit, but maybe if you could go into more details. How did these results compare to, say, the visual observations on the farm? So this is the system is telling all this, but there was also on-farm monitoring. How did this, was this more accurate, less accurate? How did it compare that way? Oh, and I gotta unmute you. There, let's see a second. Julio, are you able to? There we go. Can you do a sound check, Julio?
Yep. So
there we go. Yep.
So basically, the answer to the question is all the results that I showed, right? So I think if you think our gold standard, so our reference test for this experiment was visual observation in combination with this farm had daily milk weights in place. They had conductivity for mastitis detection, and they used body temperature for the first 10 days in milk, keto stick for ketosis detection for the first 10 days in milk for all cows, and then after 10 days in milk, any cow that was suspected to have any potential issue through visual observation, she was tested for body temperature and for ketosis with a keto stick. You know, the one that deserves a little more of description or attention to is Metritis. So this farm had a very, very stringent criteria. So they really didn't like to let any cows go away, with Metritis. So, if you actually look at our data, and I don't have the time to go through this, but the incidence of Metritis was very high. It was like 30%, which basically means that they were diagnosing a lot of cows with Metritis. And this is an excellent farm, a very well managed farm. So, I think that it was a little bit in the upper level because of the amount of pressure that they put with diagnosis, which even explains some of our results. So again, we compare the performance of the system to a very intensive health monitoring program that used visual observation, daily meal weights, keto stick, body temperature, and rectal palpation for evaluation of metritis. What I forgot to mention is that any cow not diagnosed with metritis by 8 days in milk, she would have been palpated and her uterine discharge would have been evaluated. So that also, in a way, helped make sure that all cows were identified. So.
Great. Now, the next questions, for some of these instances of diseases, it seems that there's not enough early detection to prevent the health issue. Is there a comment you'd make to that, or is there enough early identification to help limit decreased production?
Well, based on the results of our research, it seems like at least this type of system is generating a very early alert. What we haven't done, and what we are about to do now in 2 other experiments, is see how these cows look like. So once that the system generates the alert, so what are the potential signs that we can identify to treat them earlier? But we don't know from this experiment. And as I mentioned that later in my presentation, is one of the potential challenges, right? So is that some cows will be flagged very early and they don't have any clinical signs at the moment, which basically will not be very helpful for the person that is in front of the cow and trying to make a decision. So there is a potential to use prophylactic treatments. If there is at least some suspicion that it may be a particular type of disorder, use a prophylactic treatment. But very honestly, I don't think that we have done enough research as to know what to do or provide a recommendation. Andrew, you're passing on some of my slides that are after the end.
Yeah, it's just showing some of the things that you're working on there.
Yeah.
And that links to actually one of the questions you went into. It is, this is very informative information, but is there further research being done? Which I think you've mentioned here about a little bit. Is there other research projects stemming off of this that you're currently working on?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have 2 very large studies where we're going to be, in one, evaluating in more detail some of these changes in the parameters that are monitored by sensors around health disorders, so before and after. And we're going to include multiple sensors, so we're going to go well beyond rumination and activity. And then there's another experiment that we're about to start where we will be actually comparing a health monitoring program has done by the average farm versus a health monitoring program run by an automated health monitoring system. So stay tuned for that research. We're very excited about it, but we are still at very early stages.
Okay. Another question that's come in is, how often or how much time does it take to install and keep these monitoring devices in place?
Okay, I think so. Maybe Chris is better equipped to answer that question. So it's not what I do all the time. We only install it once for our research. So that is usually something that is worked out with the company. So I don't know if Chris wants to.
I don't know if Chris.
I would say that moving devices from animal to animal, you're talking between a couple minutes to 10 minutes, depending on full device and recording the ID of the sensor and visible ID.
I would add that it's very dependent on the type of facilities available. I mean, the availability of headlocks, I think that is critical. So it depends.
Okay. Next question that came in: does the software, where is it here, have the ability to tell you which type of disease or instance it's going to have, or just that it's higher probability of risk for a disease?
That's a really good question. So the software, at the time that we used the software from the system, so from the HR tags, there was no way to tell exactly the type of health disorder. So I don't know if that has changed. It is my understanding that that has not changed. So the answer would be no. So the whole idea is that the system identify those cows that should be examined through a typical clinical exam, right? So the system will identify the cows that should be checked, and then there is the check to determine that. Part of our research, our ongoing research, is geared towards that. So we are very interested on seeing how the information provided by different sensors can help us identify the type of health disorder. I don't know if we will be able to determine exactly the type of health disorder, but I think that we can point out farm personnel to specific systems, like, you know, is the udder, is the uterus, or is the metabolic and digestive disorder. I think, you know, I have a lot of hope that that will be possible. I don't know if it will be exactly possible to tell what is the type of disorder.
Okay, great. Does the SCR software operate independently of other computer software on the farm? So I think I know this with other things. Does it have to have its own machine? Can it run on a machine that's already in the farm? How does that operate?
I'll leave that answer to Chris as well. In the case of our experiment, we ran it in a different computer, but it was just our personal decision. And for example, at the Cornell Dairy Farm, where we do have the SCR system in place, we also run it in a different computer, but I have seen it in the same computer in different farms. What I think that is more important than whether you need a different computer or not, which I think you don't, is whether the information generated by the automated health monitoring system will be transferred to the general herd management software. So I think that is very important. So the ability of the automated health monitoring system software to communicate with the herd management software to generate action lists and to avoid a lot of data entry. So, you know, a lot of additional work, because in general, at least in my experience, the automated health monitoring systems need some basic information about the cow, that if the system, the software is not talking to the general management software, it will have to be entered manually. So I think that that's the most important consideration, whether or not it can be integrated or it can talk to the general dairy management software.
Cool. Chris, do you have anything to add to that, or is that about the same?
Yeah, I totally agree with Julio on that topic, and that's one thing that our technology, SCR technology, can do. We interact with all the major herd management information status on there. So that way the user can put an entry on data one place and not have to double entry.
Okay, great. Yeah, that would certainly save a lot of time and energy. But even if not, just having the list of who you have to observe closer, even if you just print it out independently and then do the observation, can certainly improve your efficiency in your time with your cattle. Next question came in. Is there a correlation between the health index and the results of manual observation? So I think what they're trying to say there is, how did this result compare to just the on-farm manual observation performance compare? Was it catching most of these? Did it catch a lot more than maybe the visual observation was catching? How did that go?
Well, once again, I think that the answer to that are the results for our experiment. But it's very important, and you know, the question allows me to elaborate a little bit more on this, right? So you have to keep in mind that there's a lot of variation across farms in the type of health monitoring program in place. So basically, as I said at the end, farms that are finding very few cows with health disorders because they're probably not looking for them, they are likely to find more cows. Farms that already have a really intensive and accurate health monitoring program, I think that those farms will not find a whole lot more cows. Basically, the idea for those farms is to replace the labor by farm personnel to identify the same cows, right? So I think that it depends a lot on what you're comparing it to. And again, our experiment is a really good example of a farm with an intensive health monitoring program, one that I consider to be pretty good, high standards, really accurate, very dedicated personnel. But a farm that does very little to find cows will probably start finding a lot more cows that were not identified before.
Okay, thank you. And another question that comes in is, does the new updates allow group evaluation to monitor ration changes? I don't know if that's a question for yourself, or maybe Chris would need to answer in there, but there's a question.
Yeah, and the software has a lot of new reporting opportunities for herds to not only understand that individual cow changes on rumination, but also those changes with group changes and overall milking group analysis. So those are some of the exciting things that we have to offer clients that are utilizing our technology.
Okay, great. No, I think that would make it even more informative and useful too, as that stuff is incorporated. Another question that came in is, I heard that the SCR is coming up with an ear tag. Is that a way of measuring any better or different than the current, I think, the neck chain or the neck tag currently?
We're very excited with a lot of the new things that SCR has, as opportunities to for cow sensoring, understanding what cows are doing day in, day out. And those are opportunities both regionally where this technology is available. So the new eSense tag is currently available in the U.S. So we'd be more than happy to discuss with users who are considering this means of sensoring. We look at it as another opportunity, not that one is better than another, but another opportunity for customers to choose means of what's best for their operation.
Okay, great. And then the last question that I've had come in here is, what was the incidence of cattle with a significant rumination drop that were not detected by on-farm personnel? Was the detection of the disease by on-farm personnel aided by daily milk weights?
So the answer to the second question is yes. So farm personnel was using daily milk weights, as I mentioned earlier. And then the answer to the first question is somewhat related to the false positives. So we do not know some of the false positives were cows that were missed by farm personnel. So that is a potential reason for being called false positives. But I don't know exactly what the percentage is. And that is something that we will probably be able to determine with more accuracy in our experiments. I mean, it sounds like a simple thing, but it's quite complicated to evaluate that. So, we have been struggling a lot to determine that and figuring out the best way of doing that. But, it's certainly something that we are interested in. The short answer, again, would be that it would be somewhere close to the false positive outcomes in this experiment, assuming that the farm was really, really good finding sick cows.
Okay, great. And let me, here we got another one. Another question come in just as I was asking. Does the cow temperature give you a better indication of cow health analysis? Is it possible in an ear?
Okay, so I'll say that I'm not very familiar with a lot of research in that area. I have personally not done any research here in our lab, so I don't have any data to indicate that is good or bad. So I'm only aware of some research published by Dr. Jeff Bewley, which, if I do not recall wrong, the correlation between ear surface temperature and core body temperature was in the mid-60s. So the correlation was in the mid-60s. So apparently it's highly influenced by environmental temperature changes. So that is all that I know at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, one of our goals for our ongoing research, or soon to start research, is to also include core body temperature. So we will be evaluating intraruminal boluses that monitor body temperature. So hopefully we'll have some research in the future in relationship to that. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of data at the moment.
And actually, I do have the Dr. Bewley study. I just got to find the link for it. So I will get that from the University of Kentucky for you viewer 36 when he comparing the two, because I am familiar with that actual presentation that he has made.
Okay.
With that, I think that I'm just checking my 4 or 5 different spots where we're putting in questions that I got everyone's questions answered, but I think we did able to get them all accomplished, so I do appreciate that. I want to thank you, Dr. Julio Giordano, for taking the time to share this with us. I know it's a lot of information to go through in such a short period, but I do appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk us through it and then certainly to answer our questions. We found it very, very informative and very eye-opening as we look to better improve our our health detection issues on our herd, so I do appreciate that.
You're very welcome, and thanks everybody again for staying. It was my pleasure to present this data, and if anybody would like to contact me, you have my email at the end of my presentation, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yep. And with that, as we mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, there will be a recording of this that will be out tomorrow. We do have the information here as well, but there will be out tomorrow, the recording. I will make sure that we also, any questions you further have, or if you think of something afterwards, we will get it through to him, or you can send it to his email that I now have on screen. With that, I also want to thank the CMX Alliance for helping us present today's presentation. They've been very, very helpful. And Chris, thank you for answering a few questions there. And if they had any further questions, I'm sure they could reach out to yourself, Chris, or where would you like us to direct them if they have further questions from that regard?
That'd be great. You can email me at dan@cmx.com.
Yep, and I will put that in the chat box here in a second for everyone, so that you can, if you have questions, you can get that. We'll also include it in the information that we send out as a follow-up. Everyone who did sign up for today's webinar will get the recording sent to their inbox, and we'll make sure we put all this information in there for you as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining with us today. We certainly had a lot of people. We had over 120 different people come on at some different points, and of course, we usually get the large majority, about 90% of the people watch it in the video afterwards. So we do appreciate those of you who joined us today, and if you want to rewatch it, it will be available tomorrow. And thanks everyone, and have a great day.